The house waits in silence, its frame sagging under the weight of years, its skin of brick and stone strangled by a slow, patient web of ivy. Windows gape, like blind eyes, streaked with rain and time, staring into nothing. The air here carries the scent of damp wood and something older, something that has been rotting far longer than any living memory. They say the walls speak, when the night is deep enough, that if you stand still, if you dare to listen, you will hear them murmuring the names of the dead. No one knows if the voices belong to the ones who once lived here, or to something that was always here, waiting. The Damnation family built this estate, brick by brick, as if raising a monument to their own pride. But the locals will tell you the foundation was not laid in stone alone. They whisper that the sins of the bloodline are buried in its bones, that each act of cruelty, each betrayal, each unholy bargain, seeped into the mortar, until the house itself began to breathe with it. I walk the halls now, and every step seems to echo longer than it should, like the sound is being carried away somewhere unseen. There is a room at the end of a warped corridor, the wood swollen from years of neglect. Behind a false wall, I found them, a stack of diaries bound in leather so dark it seemed to drink the light. The pages tremble in my hands as I turn them, the ink faded but still alive, each line a quiet confession written to no one, or perhaps to something. The handwriting changes over the years, but the tone never does. Fear runs through every word, a fear that seems to know it will never be answered. I should not be here. That thought comes again and again, low and certain, like a voice that is not mine. Dust floats in the air like ash from a fire long dead, and yet the air feels warm against my skin, as if someone is standing too close. I cannot tell if the sound I hear is wind moving through the broken beams, or the faint rhythmic whisper of a name I do not recognize. Somewhere deeper inside, something waits to be found, or perhaps it is waiting to find me. The name Damnation first appears in the ledgers of 17th century Europe, written in the careful, ink-stained hand of merchants who seemed uneasy to record it. Elias Damnation was not born into wealth, yet within a single decade, his fortune swelled beyond measure. Official records speak of maritime trade, of goods ferried between continents on ships that bore no flag and answered to no port. But the cargo he moved was unlike anything recognized by crown or church. The manifests were written in code, listing items that could not be classified as animal or human, fragments of bone that belonged to no known creature, idols carved from black stone, their surfaces warm to the touch, chests sealed with wax and iron that no customs officer dared open. Whispers began in the harbor towns, tales of sailors who returned pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what they had seen in the ship's hold. Elias returned from one such voyage with enough gold to purchase a vast stretch of land far from the city's reach. The previous owners were never seen again. Neighbors claimed they had left in the dead of night, though no wagons, no footsteps and no farewells were witnessed. On that ground Elias built the first Damnation estate, its walls rising with unnatural speed, as though the stones themselves were eager to be placed. Those who labored on it swore they heard strange chanting at dusk, voices that seemed to echo from beneath the soil. Folklore insists the land was not empty before Elias claimed it. Older still were the stories of a clearing used for rites long before the first chapel was raised in the region. Farmers avoided it, saying their cattle grew sick if they grazed too close, and that the ground bled dark water when pierced by a spade. The ruins of crude stone circles lay scattered in the woods, their edges blackened as if by fire that never burned out. The manor's foundations were dug deeper than necessary, descending into earth that smelled of salt and ash. Workers told of unearthing relics as they dug, coins stamped with symbols no scholar could name, jars sealed with skin and rope, and masks that seemed to watch from the shadows. Most were carted away by Elias himself, disappearing into the locked rooms of his private quarters. When the estate was complete, it did not sit upon the land so much as sink into it, the walls heavy and watchful. Visitors described a sense that the building was older than its own construction, as though it had always been there, waiting for someone to return. Elias lived there alone at first, but it is said the house was never truly empty. On nights when the wind shifted, neighbors swore they could hear the low hum of voices, calling to something deep below the stone, and something they believed was listening. It was on a night when the sky held no moon, when even the stars seemed to have turned their faces away, that Elias Damnation made the first oath. The diaries speak of it only in fragments, their words smudged as though the ink itself recoiled from what was written. But piecing together letters, witness accounts, and the trembling notes of a priest who refused to speak of it aloud, the shape of the night emerges. The manor was new then, its stones still raw from the earth, its halls echoing with the emptiness of rooms not yet lived in. Yet there was no celebration, no feast to bless the home. Instead there was the gathering. Villagers who lived on the outskirts told of lights in the field behind the manor. Unnatural lights, red and gold, rising and falling as though something breathed them into being. They spoke of voices chanting in a language that had no shape in their ears, words that seemed to twist in the mind like smoke, impossible to hold on to, and yet impossible to forget. And there was the smell, acrid, heavy, clinging to the air for days after, the smell of burning flesh, though no one could say from what. Those who dared creep closer claimed they saw Elias standing in the center of a ring of stones, each one older than memory, each smeared with something dark. He was not alone. Tall figures stood with him, their faces lost in shadow, their movements slow and deliberate. In his hands he held a silver blade, and before him a shallow bowl. Witnesses swore they saw him draw the blade across his own palm, the blood falling into the bowl like thick wine. Others whispered that it was not his own blood he offered, but something taken from the earth itself. When the chanting stopped, there came a silence so deep it rang in the ears. Then the wind rose without warning, and the lights flared white, so bright they burned the eyes of those who watched from the trees. In that moment, something shifted. The air grew heavier, as if pressing down upon the land, and the witnesses fled, stumbling through the dark. From that night on, the fortunes of the Damnation family grew with unnatural speed. Ships returned heavy with goods, deals closed before they were spoken, rivals faded into ruin. Yet the diaries hint at another truth, that Elias had not bought this power but borrowed it. And like all debts, the payment would one day come due. They were 8 and 11. The last of the young heirs, their laughter one of the few warm sounds that still moved through the manor. In the early autumn of 1803, that laughter fell silent. The servants tell it the same way, even decades later, their voices dropping as though the memory itself might overhear. It was nearing dusk when they saw the children in the orchard, their small figures framed by the long shadows of gnarled apple trees. They were not alone. A tall figure walked ahead of them, cloaked in black, its face hidden, its steps too slow to be human, yet the children followed without hesitation. The orchard was thick with mist that night, and within minutes they were gone. The search began before night fully fell. Lanterns swung through the fields, hounds were sent into the woods, and voices called until they cracked. No sign of them was found, no footprints, no torn fabric, not even the crush of grass where small feet might have run. Yet the next morning, the apples that had fallen overnight were all rotted through, their skins black and curling, as if months of decay had passed in a single night. Months later, whispers began in the village. Travelers claimed they had seen 2 children standing at the edge of the Damnation estate, their skin pale as bone, their eyes dark as the winter river. They did not speak, did not move, only stood together as the fog swirled around them until it carried them out of sight. No one who saw them went closer. It was in the matriarch's private diary that the truth began to take a shape, though not a full one. The ink there is hurried, desperate, as if the hand that wrote it feared being caught. She writes of keeping them safe from the bargain, of hiding them from the one who will claim them. But then her tone changes. The words grow colder. It must be done, she writes. The shadow must be fed, or the rest will be taken." No one knows what she meant, but after that winter, the matriarch never left her rooms. Curtains were drawn tight, and the servants spoke of a smell like damp stone that lingered in the halls. The heirs were never found, not in life, nor in death. And yet, on nights when the orchard fog thickens, some claim they still hear soft footsteps among the trees, and a voice, low, patient, calling them back inside. They called it a celebration, a feast to honor the reach of the Damnation Empire as its ships and influence spread across oceans. The invitations were written in gold script, sealed with black wax, and carried the promise of excess. On the evening of the banquet in 1823, carriages lined the long drive, their wheels crunching over gravel dusted with frost. Inside the grand hall, light from 100 candles flickered against mirrors and gilt, the air rich with perfume and the scent of roasting meat. Guests wore their finest, unaware they were stepping into something far older than a party. The food was unlike anything they had tasted. Cuts of meat that bled black when sliced, their juices pooling like ink. Wines so deep in color they seemed to drink the light from the crystal, burning the throat, yet leaving a strange sweetness behind. For a time laughter and conversation flowed freely, but then came the silences, pauses where eyes grew unfocused, where words faltered mid-sentence. Some guests swore the room shifted, its walls stretching farther away, its ceiling impossibly high. Others saw figures moving just beyond the candlelight, their shapes blurred, their presence cold. One man claimed the meat on his plate was still breathing. A woman dropped her glass, her face pale, whispering that something in the wine had spoken her name. Panic came in waves. Those who tried to leave found the great doors heavy and unmoving, as though the wood itself refused them. The air grew thick, carrying a faint, acrid taste that clung to the tongue. By the end of the night, several guests lay collapsed on the marble floor. When their mouths were pried open, no breath escaped, only a slow spill of fine grey ash. Servants moved among the bodies without surprise, stepping carefully, their expressions unreadable. By dawn, the dead had been removed, and the hall was scrubbed clean. The family offered condolences, speaking of sudden illness, an unfortunate and unexplained contagion. But letters uncovered decades later tell another story. Correspondence between the Damnation siblings speaks of the benefactor and the need to provide it with sustenance. It will not be satisfied with words. One letter reads, "It must taste what it is owed." They speak of fear as a seasoning, of delirium as a tenderizing, and of death as the final course. No charges were ever brought against the family. The official records of the night are brief, clinical, absent of detail, but among the villagers, the tale remains. They say the banquet of ash was not a tragedy, but an offering, and that what was fed that night has never stopped hungering. The portraits were the first thing visitors noticed when they stepped into the manor's great hall. Lining the walls in heavy, dust-laden frames, they seemed to lean forward in the dim light, as though curious about whoever had crossed the threshold. Guests often remarked on how finely they were painted, each face rendered with a precision that caught the smallest glint in an eye, the faintest crease in a brow. But it was the eyes themselves that unsettled. They did not simply look out at the room, they followed. When a guest moved, the gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, as if unwilling to break contact. The most notorious of these was the portrait of Elias Damnation. Painted during his final years, it should have been fixed in time, yet those who returned to the estate after many years claimed it had changed. A thin scar across his cheek that was not there before, burns that darkened the skin around his jaw, a shadow growing behind him that had no source in the painted scene. These were not errors of memory. Multiple visitors, strangers to one another, described the same changes. Some refused to pass through the hall altogether, choosing instead the long way around, even if it meant walking in darkness. Others swore they saw the faintest twitch of lips on the portraits, a curl into something too much like a smile, though no warmth touched the painted eyes. In the winter months when the fire burned low, the room seemed to breathe with the smell of something charred, faint and bitter. It was an art historian, invited to catalogue the collection in the mid-1800s, who left behind the most disturbing account. His notes, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, detail his examination of the pigments. Beneath layers of oil and varnish, he found traces of organic material, fragments of bone ground fine, flecks of hair, and something darker that his instruments could not name. The colors, he wrote, were richer than any he had seen because they had been fed with life itself. He left before completing his work, abandoning most of his equipment. His final entry is a single line, pressed so hard into the page the paper nearly tore. They are not paintings of the family. They are the family. Now the portraits remain, their varnish cracked, their colors deepened with time. Dust gathers thick on the frames, yet the eyes remain sharp, glinting in the half-light. Those who stand too long beneath their gaze speak of a pressure in the chest, a prickling at the back of the neck, and the deep, uneasy certainty that the house is not only watching, but remembering. The winter of 1846 came early, sweeping down from the hills with a cold that seemed to carry weight. Snow lay heavy on the roof of the Damnation estate, muffling the world in a silence that felt unnatural. But inside, there was no peace. For weeks the servants had been whispering among themselves, voices low, glances sharp. The unrest began after the livestock was found butchered in the stables, each carcass arranged in shapes no one could understand, spirals, intersecting lines, and circles of bone. Blood had been drawn into patterns in the snow, as if the ground itself had been marked for something. Then came the noises. At night, when the fires burned low, the servants claimed they heard children crying beneath the floorboards. The sounds were faint, muffled by layers of wood and stone, but they came from rooms where no children lived. Some swore they felt vibrations under their feet, as if something moved deep below, pacing in the dark. The family dismissed the fears, ordering the servants to their work, but the unease only grew. By mid-December, the rebellion began. Armed with knives from the kitchen and tools from the sheds, the servants confronted the family in the great hall, demanding to leave without punishment, without pursuit. But the family did not answer with words. The private guards emerged from the shadows, blades drawn, their faces expressionless in the flickering light. The fighting was quick and vicious. Screams rose into the rafters, muffled by the thick snow outside. By dawn, the drifts around the estate were streaked with red, and the bodies of the fallen lay where they had dropped until the ground was too frozen to bury them. Those who escaped fled into the blizzard, their shapes swallowed by the white. They never returned, but their stories followed them into the villages, stories of the smell of blood that lingered for days, of the way the snow around the estate refused to melt come spring. In the years that followed, the winters grew harsher. With each storm, strange accidents plagued the estate. Workers slipped on unseen ice and fell to their deaths. Horses bolted without cause, dragging sledges into the frozen river. Guests were found outside, frozen solid, their expressions twisted in fear though no footprints marked their path into the snow. Locals came to call it the Winter of Knives, a season when the wind carried the echo of that long night, and when the air itself seemed sharp enough to cut. Even now, when the first snow begins to fall, some say they hear it, the muffled cries under the floor, and the crunch of boots moving through drifts, though no one is there. The scandal began quietly, with whispers that the bloodline of the Damnations had stretched beyond the bounds of marriage. In 1862, the truth stepped into the open in the form of a boy. No one knew his mother, and those who might have spoken her name chose not to. He was brought to the estate without ceremony, his place in the family unacknowledged, but never denied. His pale eyes were the first thing anyone noticed, so light they seemed almost colorless, catching the dimmest light and holding it in a way that unsettled even the servants. From his earliest days, He was drawn to the crypt. The locked doors, the damp air that leaked up from below, seemed to call to him. By 12, he had learned how to slip inside, ignoring the cold that made others shiver, moving among the rows of stone coffins with a strange reverence. Those who caught glimpses of him there said he would kneel beside a particular wall, pressing his ear to the stone, lips moving in a slow, measured rhythm. Sometimes they swore they heard a second voice answering, faint, rasping, and coming from deep within the rock. The family tolerated his behavior, though unease followed him like a shadow. There was a story told among the maids that once when the boy returned from the crypt, his hair and clothes smelled of salt water, as though he had been standing by the sea. Others claimed his eyes grew darker over the years, not with age but with something seeping into him from the depths below. On the morning of his 17th birthday, he was gone. His bed was undisturbed, his boots still by the door. The only sign of him lay in the crypt. One of the stone slabs, carved with names so weathered they could barely be read, had been pushed aside. Beneath it, a stairway spiraled down into darkness, vanishing beyond the reach of any lamp. The air rising from it was heavy, almost wet, and carried the faintest sound, like breathing, slow and patient. No search was made. The family ordered the slab dragged back into place, sealing the gap as though it had never been opened. They spoke of the boy only once, in a single curt statement, that he had moved on. In the village, the story took a different shape. They said he had not been taken against his will, that he had been summoned, that the voice he had answered for years had finally called him home. And somewhere beneath the earth, far deeper than the crypt itself, he now walks in darkness, pale eyes open, listening still. By the turn of the century, the Damnation estate had become a subject of fascination for the curious and the brave. Paranormal investigators arrived with cameras, notebooks, and instruments they swore could measure the unseen. Yet the house was never still for them. They spoke of the air shifting in ways they could not explain, the faint sensation of pressure against the skin, as though the building itself was drawing breath. Some claimed the very walls swelled and relaxed, doors easing open not with the sudden force of a draft, but slowly, deliberately, as if in response to an unseen rhythm. Curtains stirred in windless rooms, their movements gentle but purposeful, like the twitch of an animal's ear at a distant sound. At night, in the deeper halls, a faint rasp could be heard, the low hum of something moving air through a great, unseen lung. The walls bore their own marks of life. Dark, damp patches would bloom suddenly on clean plaster, their shapes disturbingly human, long fingers splayed wide, palms pressed flat, as if someone had leaned into the wall from the other side. These stains would vanish just as suddenly, leaving the surface dry and cool, but always after the witnesses had looked away. One investigator, meticulous and skeptical, decided to leave a recorder running in one of the disused upstairs rooms. He set it on the floor, checked the tape, and locked the door behind him. By morning, he returned to find the room unchanged. The air was still, the light flat and grey, but when he played back the tape, the silence was not empty. At first there was nothing but the faint hiss of the machine. Then came the breathing, soft, steady, impossibly close to the microphone. It grew louder, more urgent, each exhale carrying a hint of a low, guttural sound, too deep for a human throat. By the final minutes of the recording, the breathing had quickened into a rhythm of panic or rage, until it broke into a sound no one who heard it could forget. A scream that seemed to claw at the inside of the skull, sharp enough to feel, low enough to rattle the chest. The investigator left that day and never returned. He refused to release the tape in full, offering only fragments to those who asked, and yet the rumor spread that in those final moments, beneath the scream, another sound could be heard, something like the slow, patient intake of breath, as though the house, even then, was not finished. Lilith Damnation was 16 when the first signs began. At first it was only oddness, a tendency to drift away mid-conversation, her gaze fixed on some distant point no one else could see. Then the writing started. Sheets of paper filled with looping, jagged lines in a language no scholar could name, symbols that seemed to shift when looked at for too long. She wrote in secret at first, but soon her obsession spilled into the open. The servants found scraps tucked into drawers, scrawled on walls, even scratched into the underside of tables with whatever sharp edge she could find. When they took away her pens, she turned to her own skin. Thin cuts in careful, deliberate patterns began appearing on her arms, her legs, and once across her collarbone. The marks were not random. They matched the symbols in her writings. Her parents, pale with fear and shame, locked her in the East Wing, a set of rooms, long unused and heavy with dust. The door was barred, and the only visitors were those who brought her food, left quickly, and did not look her in the eye. But the neighbors swore they saw her. On nights when the fog rolled thick across the grounds, they claimed her figure appeared in the East Wing window. She never moved, never called out, only stood with her hands at her sides. And behind her shapes loomed, tall, thin shadows, their outlines unsteady, as if made of smoke. Weeks passed. Then one morning the wing was silent. When the door was opened, Lilith was found on the floor. Her body was twisted in ways no living form could endure, her head tilted back too far, her hands bent unnaturally at the wrists. Her eyes were open but empty, fixed on the cracked ceiling above. No mark of violence was found, no sign of struggle, only the faint smell of burned paper in the air. Later, in the family diary, there is an entry dated the night before her death. The ink is smeared in places, as though someone tried to rub the words away. What remains is brief, but heavy. She saw too much. Nothing more, no explanation of what she saw, or why it took her. The East Wing was sealed after that. The windows were boarded from the inside, the doors locked. Yet on certain nights, when the moon is hidden and the air is still, some say they see her there again, standing in the window, and the shadows, they say, are still with her. The years after Lilith's death slipped into a strange quiet. No letters left the estate. No guests arrived. The family's name vanished from society columns and shipping records alike. For nearly 20 years, there is nothing. No photographs, no written accounts, no mention in the ledgers of trade or travel. It was as if the Damnations had stepped out of the world entirely. The villagers watched from a distance. They said the gates were never opened, yet on certain nights, a faint glow would flicker behind the upper windows, shifting from room to room as if carried in someone's hand. Sometimes two lights moved together, pacing in parallel, pausing as though listening. Other times there was only one. No one ever saw the source. In winter, smoke curled from the chimneys, but no footprints marked the snow at the entrance. Grocers claimed deliveries were still made, though they left the crates just inside the gate, returning the next day to find them empty, the lids set neatly back in place. A postman swore that once, while passing on the road, he heard music drifting from within, low strings, playing a tune both beautiful and unbearably sad. The strangest sightings came from those who strayed too close. They spoke of figures glimpsed through the frost on the glass, blurred and slow-moving. Once, a man claimed he saw a woman's face watching him from an upstairs window, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile, simply waiting. He blinked, and she was gone. In 1927, without warning, the estate opened its gates again. The grass was cut, the front steps swept, but only 2 members of the family remained. Their names were given politely to those who asked, but little else. They attended a few public gatherings in the nearby city, their presence drawing whispers and questions. When asked about the long absence, they would only smile faintly, as if the question itself was a private joke, and change the subject. Inside the house, the staff returned to their duties without comment. New servants were hired, but they spoke little of their work and stayed only for short periods. A maid who lasted less than a month told a friend that the East Wing was colder than the rest of the house, even in summer, and that she sometimes heard footsteps above her room in the small hours, though no one lived on that floor. Whatever happened during those silent years was never written down. Yet the air within the estate seemed heavier than before, as though those missing decades still lingered there, unseen, waiting for the right moment to be remembered. In 1931, the estate gained a new resident. No one could say when he arrived, only that one day he was simply there, moving through the halls, as though he had always belonged. He was called the librarian, though no surname was ever given, and no one could recall seeing him beyond the manor's grounds. His purpose seemed clear enough. He took control of the library, a vast dust-choked room that had sat untouched for decades. Day and night, he worked in silence, cataloguing the shelves, bringing in new volumes that no one remembered purchasing. The books he tended were unlike any in polite collections. Their bindings were not of cloth or paper, but of something pale and textured, stretched tight over the covers. Some whispered it was leather, but the kind no tradesman would admit to selling. The titles were often in languages no scholar could translate, their letters jagged, curling in on themselves like withered vines. Many of the pages were brittle with age, yet the ink seemed fresh, the words glistening faintly as if still wet. Those who entered the library in his presence spoke of a voice that was wrong. When the librarian greeted them, it sounded as though two people spoke at once. One deep and slow, the other high and quick, their words overlapping but perfectly matched. It was not loud, yet it seemed to vibrate in the bones, leaving a faint ache long after the conversation ended. The subjects of the books were darker still. Summoning rites that required soil from unmarked graves, rituals of preservation involving salt, blood, and fire in careful measure, instructions for binding a soul to a place, a body, or an object. The librarian never explained the purpose of this collection, nor did the family question him, at least not where others could hear. Then, in the winter of 1937, he was gone. A maid found the library door ajar in the early morning. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. At the center of the room lay a heap of fine gray ash, perfectly round, the shape of a man. The books remained untouched, their spines gleaming faintly in the dim light. No one claimed his belongings, and in truth, no one could say they had ever seen him carry any. Yet for weeks after, servants swore they saw a figure moving in the library after dark, tall and thin, pausing before the shelves as though still taking inventory. And sometimes, when the room was empty, the sound of pages turning would drift into the hall, though not a single hand touched them. The storm that night was the kind that swallows the sky. Rain drove sideways against the windows, and the wind carried a low, steady roar that drowned out all but the loudest sounds. In the village below the hill, midnight came with a sudden break in the storm's rhythm. The church bells began to toll, their iron voices rolling through the dark. But after the 10th chime, there came another, then another, and another still. 13 in total, though the church tower held only 10. The extra tones were deeper, slower, and they did not come from the village. Witnesses said they came from the direction of the Damnation estate, carried on the wind between cracks of thunder. With the 13th toll came a flash, blinding white, that lit the hill as though daylight had burst for an instant. The upper windows of the estate flared with that light, their glass glowing, and then the storm closed in again, swallowing it whole. At dawn, the rain had passed, leaving the ground sodden and the air unnaturally still. Along the road leading away from the estate, a servant was found wandering barefoot, his clothes soaked, his eyes clouded to a pale film. He stumbled toward the villagers who found him, reaching out with trembling hands, mumbling words that only grew more frantic as they tried to help. "The door is open," he repeated. "The thing has stepped through." No amount of questioning could pull more from him before he collapsed into a shaking silence that lasted the rest of his life. Those brave enough to approach the estate in the days that followed noticed changes. The wing where the light had flared was shuttered, its windows covered from the inside with thick boards. No one was seen entering or leaving that section again. The family spoke nothing of it, and those who worked there refused to answer questions, their faces tightening at the mention of that night. In the years since, the sealed wing has become a point of quiet dread. Servants claim that during storms, faint light still seeps from the cracks in the boards, pulsing softly in time with the wind. Others say that if you press your ear to the wall on the opposite side, you can hear a slow, steady sound, not quite breathing, not quite movement, but something in between, as though whatever stepped through that night has never left. And perhaps, in the silence between thunder, it still listens for the sound of those 13 bells. It began without warning. One season the family spoke as they always had, their clipped tones echoing faintly in the long halls, and the next, their voices were gone. They communicated only through written notes, passed between them with gloved hands, the paper folded once, never twice. No explanation was given. But the change was immediate and complete. Even the youngest among them never uttered a sound. Rumors spread quickly through the village. Some said the benefactor had claimed their voices as payment, sealing their tongues in exchange for the family's continued survival. Others whispered that to speak aloud in the estate was to invite it closer, to let it hear you and know you, to mark you. Whatever the truth, the servants soon followed suit. Orders were given in sharp gestures, conversations carried out in silence. The quiet was so complete that the sound of a dropped glass seemed to ring for minutes. Guests who came to the estate in those years described the silence as something physical, heavy in the chest, pressing against the ears. Even the wind, they said, seemed to falter at the threshold, its whistle dying as it crossed into the courtyard. Fireplaces burned without the crackle of wood, and footsteps landed without echo, as though the house itself was swallowing every sound. One visitor, a businessman unaccustomed to superstition, scoffed at the practice and tried to engage the family in conversation. He laughed loudly, clapped his hands in greeting. By the end of the night, his smile had faded, his words becoming hesitant, his voice dropping to a whisper without meaning to. When he left the next morning, he did not speak again for the rest of his life. The diaries from this period are sparse but telling. A page written in a thin, hurried script reads simply, "It is always listening. It cannot be deafened, but it can be denied." Another, written in a steadier hand, offers only, "Our voices are not ours to keep." Over time, the silence became more than a habit. It became a presence. It seemed to move ahead of you in the halls, to stand behind you when you wrote your words. Some claimed they felt warm breath at their ear, as if something leaned close to catch a sound that never came. The vow lasted for years. When it finally broke, it was not with speech, but with a scream, one that echoed through the estate in the middle of the night, waking everyone. No one ever admitted to making it, and no one could say if it belonged to the living at all. The invitation to the 1962 gathering was unlike any the family had sent before. It was brief, handwritten, and bore no explanation beyond a date and an hour. The few who received it arrived to find the dining hall transformed. Every wall, from floor to ceiling, was covered in mirrors, some grand and gilded. Others cracked at the edges, their silvering warped with age. Candlelight filled the room, but instead of warmth, it cast a strange, fractured glow, multiplying endlessly in the glass. At first, the atmosphere was lively. Glasses clinked, voices rose, and the mirrored walls shimmered with the reflections of fine clothes and flushed faces. But before long, the guests began to notice oddities. A smile in the mirror that lingered a second too long after its owner's lips had gone still, a blink that came late, as though the reflection were catching up. In some cases, the reflections did not match at all. A turned head, in reality, remained staring forward in the glass, an arm resting on the table in the room, hung limp at the reflection's side. One man, pale and trembling, swore his reflection reached for him. He felt the brush of cold fingers against his sleeve before stumbling back, knocking over a chair. The mirrors around him seemed to ripple, as though disturbed water lay just beyond the glass. As the night wore on, the air in the room grew stifling. Conversations faltered, and more than one guest began to avoid looking directly at the mirrors. But it was nearly impossible not to. There was nowhere else for the eye to rest. Every movement seemed doubled, tripled, stretched across the walls like a living web. When the gathering finally ended, the guests left quickly, avoiding one another's eyes. No one spoke of what they had seen, at least not in public. But 3 of them never left their homes again. Within a month, each was found dead. The official reports were vague, fatal accidents, tragic but unconnected. Yet in each case the body was discovered with shards of mirror glass embedded in the eyes. No broken mirror was found at any of the scenes. Those who survived told their closest confidants of dreams in the weeks after the feast, dreams of walking endless corridors lined with mirrors, their own reflections waiting ahead of them, smiling in the dark. And sometimes, just before waking, they would feel it again, the cold touch on the arm, pulling them closer to the glass. Cassandra Damnation had long been a figure of quiet severity, a woman whose presence commanded rooms without raising her voice. But in the winter of 1974, something in her began to change. Servants noticed her slipping out after dark, a lantern in hand, its glass scratched and clouded with age. She would walk the grounds slowly, her head bowed, lips moving in a soft murmur that no one could understand. Those who watched from the safety of the windows said the flame inside the lantern was not always the same. At times it glowed a steady amber, casting a warm circle around her feet. But other nights, it flickered with a sickly green light, staining the snow and grass with an unnatural hue. On those nights, her shadow would lengthen across the lawn, stretching far beyond what the lantern's glow could account for, its edges sharp even against the dark. It was not uncommon to see her stop in the middle of the grounds. As though listening, she would tilt her head, her shadow swaying, and then take a few slow steps toward some unseen point before resuming her wandering path. The servants kept their distance, but whispers spread quickly. Some claimed she was searching for someone, others that she was following instructions given in dreams. Then came the night she did not return. She was seen last walking toward the orchard, the green light spilling across the bare branches. The air was heavy with fog, and within minutes, she had vanished into it. The search began at dawn, combing the grounds and the nearby woods, but there was no sign of her, no footprints beyond a certain point, no dropped scarf or glove to mark where she had gone. It was 3 days later when the lantern was found. It hung from the iron gate at the front of the estate, its glass unbroken, its flame still burning despite the wind and frost. The strange green hue was gone, leaving only a steady amber glow. No one could explain how it had come to hang there or why the flame refused to die. The lantern was brought inside, placed on a table in the great hall, but within hours, those who passed near it complained of hearing a faint whisper, Cassandra's voice, low and urgent, though the words were impossible to make out. That night, the servants moved it to the locked cellar, covering it with a cloth. Yet even there, in the deepest dark of the house, the light continued to seep through, as if the flame knew no wall could keep it in. It began as a curiosity, a story told in the village over drinks and dismissed as fancy. On certain nights in the 1980s, when the wind turned in from the east, people claimed they could hear singing drifting from the grounds of the Damnation estate. The voices were high and clear, too pure to be anything but children. The melody was strange, winding without a pattern the ear could catch, and the words, if they were words, belonged to no language anyone recognized. Most who heard it kept their distance, content to listen from the safety of their homes. But those who ventured closer swore the sound changed as they approached. It did not grow faint, as distant music should, but sharper, louder, as though the singers knew they were being watched. And always, just beneath the music, was a smell, sweet at first, like overripe peaches, but quickly turning sour, the stench of fruit, gone soft and collapsing in its own skin. During storms, The choir's song grew fierce. Lightning would flash behind the estate's silhouette, and the music would swell, echoing off the stone walls as though the house itself were joining in. Some claimed to hear harmonies then, lower voices weaving beneath the children's tones, grounding them in something heavier, something older. In 1985, a team of amateur investigators arrived, determined to capture the phenomenon. They brought cameras, microphones, and recorders, setting up just beyond the outer wall. The singing began at midnight, clear and steady. Yet when they checked their equipment, every tape was blank, the static faint and uneven, as if the machines themselves had been held underwater. The failure didn't deter them, and they moved closer on the second night. That was when the sickness came. One by one they doubled over, some vomiting, some shaking, their skin pale and damp. 2 were taken to hospital, their fevers climbing so high the doctors feared for their lives. All recovered eventually, but none returned to the estate. In the village, the story shifted. The singing was no longer a harmless oddity, it became a warning. Old rumors resurfaced about the heirs who had vanished over a century before, the children last seen walking into the orchard at dusk, led by the figure in black. Some began to believe the choir were those same souls, bound to serve the family's benefactor long after their bodies were gone. Even now, the song still rises on certain nights. If you stand in the right place, at the right time, you might hear it, sweet, distant, and impossibly sad. But you will not hear it on any recording. It is not meant to be kept, only carried. The renovations were meant to be simple, repairs to the library's aging walls, the replacement of rotting beams hidden behind shelves heavy with dust. But in the summer of 1992, as the workers began to strip away the paneling, one of them noticed a hollow sound where there should have been solid stone. The more they removed, the more certain they became that something was hidden there. Beneath layers of wood and plaster, they found it, a smooth, unbroken wall. No seams, no hinges, no handle. When they tapped it, it gave back a faint, hollow echo. It took hours of chiseling before the first crack broke through, revealing the stale breath of air trapped for decades, perhaps centuries. What lay beyond was a chamber no larger than a child's bedroom. The walls were bare and cold, but the center of the room held a circle of small wooden chairs, each one no taller than a child's knee. They were arranged with unnatural precision, their backs facing inward, as if whatever sat in them had been meant to stare at the empty air between. Above them, the ceiling was painted in deep, flaking strokes. At first, the workers thought it was a crude sun, but the longer they looked, the less it resembled anything of warmth or light. Its rays twisted into spirals, all leading toward a blackened center that seemed to draw the gaze, pulling at the edges of vision like a whirlpool. The black paint was so dark, it seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. No one spoke. Then, without warning, a wind rose, not from the doorway they had made, but from within the room itself. It swept past them, icy and sharp, carrying the faint smell of damp stone and something sweeter, almost rotten. All through the house, doors slammed against their frames, books toppled from shelves, and every light, every lamp, every flashlight went out. In the pitch dark, someone swore they heard the scrape of small chairs shifting against the floor. That was enough. The workers fled, stumbling into the daylight outside, leaving their tools where they'd dropped them. When the foreman returned the next day, the entrance they had broken into the wall was gone. The plaster had been replaced, the surface smooth and seamless, as if it had never been touched. None of the crew returned to finish the job. And in the years since, the library has remained exactly as it was, silent, heavy with dust, and holding behind one wall a room that should not exist, waiting for someone to find it again. The reel was found in a dented metal canister, tucked behind a stack of broken furniture in the farthest corner of the estate's basement. The air there was thick with dust, and the smell of damp stone, and the young man who discovered it later said he almost didn't take it. There was something about the weight of it in his hands, as if it resisted being moved. But curiosity won out, and he carried it home. It was a small reel, the kind used decades earlier, brittle with age. There were no markings on the canister, no label to hint at what it contained. He had it developed through a friend who specialized in old film stock, and when the first frames appeared, both men fell silent. The images showed the interior of the Damnation estate, but not as it looked now. The walls were whole, the furnishings intact, the halls filled with the faint haze of candlelight. People moved through them, dressed in clothing that placed the footage decades in the past. Yet there was something wrong in the way they moved, jerky, uneven, as though every few frames were missing. Their limbs bent strangely at the joints, their steps too long or too short. The faces were worse. None were in focus, no matter how close they came to the lens. Some seemed blurred, as if they had turned their heads mid-frame, but others had no features at all, just smooth, pale skin stretching from jaw to brow. The footage moved from room to room, lingering in places with no apparent reason, on a staircase landing, on a closed door, on the shadow beneath a table. Then, in the final sequence, the camera wavered as though the person holding it had stopped walking. The view tilted down to catch a glimpse of the cameraman's own feet, then slowly, unsteadily began to rise. When the lens turned toward a mirror, it did not show the figure of a man. The shape was roughly human, but the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too narrow, the arms too long, the head tilted slightly to one side, as though it could not sit straight on the neck. Where the face should have been was something shifting, like smoke caught in glass, its form never still enough to name. The film ended abruptly there, the last frame frozen mid-motion. When the urban explorer tried to replay it, the reel snapped in two. He still keeps the pieces locked away, but says he hasn't watched it since. Sometimes, though, he swears he hears the faint click of a projector starting up, even when he is alone. By 2010, the Damnation name had all but faded from public memory. The estate stood silent on its hill, its windows dark, its grounds overgrown. Only one member of the bloodline remained, Adrian Damnation, a man in his 30s who kept to himself. He was rarely seen in the village, and when he was, his visits were brief. He never lingered for conversation, but there were always whispers about the packages he carried home, parcels wrapped in brown paper, heavy enough to require both hands. Over time, those whispers grew into certainty. People claimed the packages contained rare occult texts, purchased from dealers who would not name their sources. Adrian was seen at auctions in distant cities, bidding only on certain lots, crumbling manuscripts, leather-bound volumes with no titles, bundles of loose pages bound with twine. The few who encountered him described his manner as polite but distracted, as if his thoughts were elsewhere entirely. In the autumn of 2013, the quiet broke. Neighbors reported hearing screams from the estate late one night, long drawn-out cries that seemed to come from deep within the house. They rose and fell, some sharp with fear, others low and guttural, until they ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind. The next day, the estate was still, no movement behind the windows, no sign of life on the grounds. Days passed before anyone approached. When they did, they found the front door unlocked, its hinges groaning as it opened. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, stirred only by the faint draft moving through the halls. Adrian's study lay in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, ink pots overturned, their contents bleeding into the rugs. The shelves had been pulled apart, books lying open, as if searched through in haste. On the desk, amid the chaos, sat a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was sharp and deliberate, each word pressed deep into the page. It has come to collect. No trace of Adrian was found. His bed was neatly made, his clothes still in the wardrobe, his car in the garage. The police offered no explanation, and the investigation soon closed without answers. But those who stood in the study that day spoke of an uneasy stillness, as if the house were holding its breath. Since that night, the estate has remained empty, or appears to. On some evenings, villagers claim to see a figure at the study window, standing perfectly still. They say it is too tall to be Adrian, and that when the light catches just right, the shape of its head is not quite human. The Damnation estate has been empty for years, its gates rusted, its gardens choked with weeds. Yet for all its stillness, those who enter swear it is not abandoned. Paranormal researchers come in pairs or in teams, armed with thermal cameras, recorders and meters meant to measure what cannot be seen. The first thing they notice is the heat signatures, flickers of warmth moving across otherwise cold rooms. Sometimes they appear as faint, human-shaped glows. Other times they are only shapes without form, shifting from corner to corner as if circling the intruders. Muffled voices are a constant. No matter the time of day, somewhere in the house there is always the suggestion of conversation just beyond the next wall. It is never clear, never loud enough to decipher, but the tone changes, sometimes hurried, sometimes almost amused, sometimes low and mournful. In rare moments, a word will cut through, though those who hear it never agree on what was said. Shadows move in ways that defy the light. Figures cross doorways where no one stands, slip along walls and vanish at the meeting of floor and ceiling. In one recording, a tall, thin silhouette passes across a hallway, yet the investigator standing in that very spot swears nothing moved in front of him. The house itself seems to resist intrusion. Doors that were open on arrival are found shut minutes later. Lights dim until the rooms are almost black, even when powered by portable generators. On one occasion, an entire team's equipment shut down at once, plunging them into darkness. In that silence, each of them heard the same thing, a whisper so close it felt like breath on the skin, telling them to leave. Most disturbing of all is the shifting layout. Researchers who map their route on one visit find it subtly altered the next. Hallways curve differently. Staircases end on the wrong floor, and once a doorway that led to the kitchen opened instead into a dead-end wall. The changes are never dramatic enough to prove, but always enough to leave doubt gnawing at the mind. Some investigators refuse to return, citing an oppressive heaviness that grows the deeper one moves into the house. It is a pressure that builds in the chest, and at the base of the skull, a sense that the building is no longer simply a place but a presence, and that it knows exactly where you are. Those who have felt it say the same thing: the estate does not want you there, and it will find a way to make you understand. The truth came together slowly, like fragments of a broken mirror gathered from the dust. Diaries hidden in false drawers, letters sealed and never sent, pages torn from books no one would admit owning, all of them whispered pieces of the same story. The Damnations had not simply been unlucky, nor cursed by chance. They had made a choice. Centuries ago, Elias Damnation sealed a covenant with something older than the stones beneath the estate. The earliest accounts speak of a night without moon or stars, a circle marked in blood, and a voice that did not come from any human throat. In exchange for wealth, power, and influence, the family pledged themselves to feed it. Not with offerings of gold or prayer, but with the things that carried the deepest weight: fear, flesh, and souls. It was not always death. Sometimes it was terror carefully sown and harvested, the slow unspooling of a mind until nothing remained but trembling obedience. Other times it was the taking of a life in the moment of greatest despair, when the soul slipped free and could be gathered like ripe fruit. And on rare nights, it was something stranger, an opening of a door, an invitation for it to take what it pleased. The covenant was not a single act, but a chain that bound every generation. Children were taught early, sometimes without knowing it, to play their part. Guests were chosen for reasons no one spoke aloud. Servants stayed only so long as they were useful. Those who vanished became part of the quiet record, their absence another offering. The family's decline was not from rebellion or from failing their part in the pact. It came from fulfilling it too well. Over the centuries, they gave and gave until the estate was emptied of everything but itself. The benefactor's hunger was endless, but the bloodline had thinned, the servants had fled, and the villagers no longer came close enough to be taken. The last entries in the most recent diary are the most telling. Written in a tight, shaking hand, they read, "It is restless. It remembers the promise. We have nothing left to give." In the margin, a final note: what is taken is never enough. No one knows what happened in those final years, only that the house remains. Some believe the covenant still binds the land itself, that the presence waits for the moment another will speak the words, make the cut, and seal the bargain again. Others say it no longer waits at all. That hunger, once invited, never leaves. It only grows more patient. The grass along the drive is high and brittle, bowing in the wind as I make my way toward the house. Clouds hang low over the hill, pressing the air down until it feels thick in my lungs. The smell reaches me before I touch the steps. Damp earth, heavy and clinging, as though the ground itself has been freshly turned. The estate rises out of it like a shadow given weight, its windows black, its walls streaked with the slow work of rain and time. The first step inside is like crossing into another season. The air is warmer, close, and it carries a sound I cannot mistake. The whispers are everywhere now, curling out from the corners, seeping from the cracks between the boards. They are not murmurs of the dead. These are names I know, names of the living. Some belong to those in the village, some to people I have not seen in years. And once, for the briefest moment, I hear my own. Each room feels aware, as if my presence brushes against something that has been sleeping just beneath the surface. The floorboards give under my weight, but not with age. It is the sensation of something shifting to accommodate me. In the hall, a door I pass swings shut on its own, not with a slam, but with a slow, deliberate click. I move deeper, my footsteps swallowed by the heavy air. The house seems to breathe around me. Curtains draw in and out without wind, and the walls carry a faint, damp pulse. In the great hall, the darkness pools in the corners, stretching along the floor like spilled ink. My light catches on something there just for a moment, a shape too still to be shadow, gone before I can turn toward it. It is then I understand. The hunger here did not end with the Damnation name. The bargain may have been theirs, but what they fed has no loyalty, no end. It only waits for new voices, new faces, new fear. As I reach the front door again, the sound changes. The whispers fade, replaced by breathing. It is faint at first, close enough to mistake for my own, but it grows heavier with each step I take. By the time my hand touches the iron handle, it is loud enough to drown out my thoughts, filling my head with the steady rhythm of inhale and exhale. I step outside into the grey light, but the breathing follows, low, patient, just behind my ear. And as I walk down the drive, I cannot shake the certainty that the house is still watching, and that it has learned my name.